In the twilight of the French colonial empire, the geographical entity known as French Indochina was a landscape defined by sharp contrasts, where ancient traditions were slowly being eroded by the relentless march of European imperialism. It was within this complex socio-political environment, in the quiet, unassuming fishing village of Prek Sbauv, located in Kampong Tom province, that Saloth Sar was born in March 1925. The boy who would one day become the architect of one of the 20th century's most horrific genocides did not emerge from the grinding poverty he would later claim to champion. On the contrary, the Saloth family was remarkably prosperous by rural Cambodian standards. They owned 50 acres of fertile rice paddies, significantly more than the average peasant, and their large wooden home stood as a testament to their local influence and affluence. Furthermore, the family possessed a deeply entrenched, almost paradoxical connection to the highest echelons of the Cambodian aristocracy. Saloth Sar's sister, Rayong, and his cousin, Mayak, had both been absorbed into the opulent orbit of the royal court, serving as dancers and concubines to King Sisowath Monivong. This early environment of provincial privilege, quietly underwritten by royal patronage, established a foundation of comfort and access that would soon draw the young boy away from the rural countryside and directly into the corridors of Cambodian royalty. This proximity to the royal palace in Phnom Penh dictated the course of Saloth Sar's early childhood, separating him from the agrarian lifestyle he would later obsessively idolize. In 1934, at the age of 9, he was sent to live in the sprawling, bustling capital city. Under the guardianship of his brother Loth, who worked as a palace clerk, and his cousin Meek, Sar was immersed in a world of absolute hierarchy, strict protocol, and traditional Khmer culture. He spent a year serving as a novice monk at Wat Botum Vade, a prestigious royal monastery located adjacent to the palace grounds. Here, beneath the ornate stupas and the watchful eyes of senior monks, the young boy was subjected to the rigorous discipline of Theravada Buddhism. He learned the Pali language, studied sacred texts, and was heavily indoctrinated into the conservative, deeply structured worldview that characterized Cambodian society. The monastic life demanded total submission to authority, the suppression of individual desire, and strict adherence to communal rules. While the spiritual tenets of Buddhism seemingly failed to take root in his soul, the mechanisms of absolute control, the erasure of the individual in favor of the collective, and the enforcement of rigid discipline were profound psychological frameworks that the quiet, mild-mannered youth internalized deeply during his formative years in the capital. Yet, this proximity to power and strict monastic discipline did not translate into academic brilliance when Saloth Sar transitioned into the secular education system. He was enrolled in the École Miche, a Catholic primary school catering to the local elite and French colonial administrators. Surrounded by the children of the privileged, Sar was a remarkably unremarkable student. He struggled profoundly with the classical French curriculum, failing to grasp the nuances of the language and the intricacies of the academic subjects required to ascend the traditional colonial ladder. His continued academic mediocrity eventually led to his transfer to the Collège Préa Sihanouk in the provincial town of Kampong Cham, and later to the École Technique in Phnom Penh, where he was relegated to studying carpentry and basic mechanics. This period was crucial in shaping his psychological profile. Surrounded by a colonial system that rewarded intellectualism and French cultural assimilation, areas where he consistently failed, Sar developed a quiet, simmering resentment toward the educated elite. The intellectual inferiority he experienced bred a deep-seated suspicion of academics urban sophisticates and intellectuals. He was a young man caught between the privilege of his family's connections and his own inability to succeed within the established meritocracy, laying the psychological groundwork for a deep antipathy toward the educated classes.
Despite his lackluster academic record, a sudden stroke of bureaucratic fortune altered his destiny in 1949 when he was inexplicably awarded a government scholarship to study radio electronics in Paris.
Arriving in post-World War II France, Saloth Sar found himself in a nation still physically recovering from Nazi occupation, but intellectually overflowing with radical ideas. The left bank of Paris was a crucible of political ferment, teeming with debates on existentialism, anti-colonialism, and communism. For a provincial youth from a French protectorate, the sheer scale of the metropole was both alienating and intoxicating. While he was nominally enrolled at the École Française de Radioélectricité, the complex schematics and mathematical rigors of electronics held little interest for him. Instead, the real education of Saloth Sar occurred in the smoky cafes, student hostels, and cramped apartments of Paris. He was drawn into a vibrant community of expatriate students from across the French Empire, all grappling with the shared humiliation of colonial subjugation. It was here, thousands of miles from the rice paddies of Kampong Thom and the royal palace of Phnom Penh, that the mild-mannered student began to search for an ideological framework that could explain his inherent resentments and offer a path to national liberation. This search inevitably led him to the Circle Marxist, a clandestine study group formed by radicalized Cambodian students, including future high-ranking Khmer Rouge figures like Ieng Sari, Khieu Samphan, and Hu Yuan. Under the mentorship of these more intellectually gifted peers, Saloth Sar was introduced to the rigid doctrines of Marxism-Leninism. He officially joined the French Communist Party in 1952, immersing himself in the writings of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and most crucially, Joseph Stalin. While his peers engaged in complex dialectical debates, Sar gravitated toward the brutal pragmatism of Stalinism. He was less interested in Marxist economic theory than in the mechanics of capturing and maintaining absolute power. The concept of the vanguard party, a secretive, highly disciplined, and utterly ruthless organization capable of bending the masses to its will, resonated deeply with him. He also began reading the works of Mao Zedong, absorbing the idea that a communist revolution in an agrarian society could bypass the industrial working class and be waged directly by the peasantry. In Paris, his political metamorphosis was complete. The apathetic student of carpentry and radio electronics had been radicalized, convinced that only a violent, uncompromising revolution led by a secretive vanguard could purify Cambodia of its colonial and feudal past. His complete devotion to this newfound revolutionary zeal came at the direct expense of his formal education. Having failed his examinations 3 years in a row, his scholarship was unceremoniously revoked, forcing his return to Cambodia in January 1953. He arrived in a country on the precipice of massive political upheaval. King Norodom Sihanouk was in the midst of his royal crusade for independence, successfully leveraging political maneuvering and the looming threat of armed rebellion to extract concessions from a weakened France. As the nation celebrated its impending sovereignty, Saloth Sar slipped quietly into the shadows. He evaluated the fractured landscape of the Cambodian opposition, which was divided between moderate Democrats, royalist sycophants, and a disorganized communist underground. Operating with the intense secrecy that would become his hallmark, Sar embedded himself within the local communist movement, which was at the time heavily dominated by seasoned Vietnamese revolutionaries. He masked his Parisian radicalization behind his characteristically polite, unassuming demeanor, carefully observing the power dynamics at play. He recognized that the Cambodian communist movement was incredibly weak, intellectually dependent, and structurally subordinated to the geopolitical goals of their more powerful Vietnamese comrades, a reality he found profoundly intolerable. Driven by the need to understand guerrilla warfare firsthand, Saloth Sar left Phnom Penh in August 1953 and journeyed into the dense malarial jungles of Kampong Cham province to join the Viet Minh. This period of embedding with the hardened Vietnamese communist fighters was a brutal but essential military apprenticeship. He observed their mastery of clandestine organization, their strict internal discipline, and their ability to mobilize the rural peasantry. However, his time in the jungle was primarily defined by a growing, visceral resentment toward his hosts. The Vietnamese treated the Khmer cadres not as equal revolutionary brothers, but as junior partners to be patronized, controlled, and utilized for Vietnam's broader strategic objectives in Indochina. Sar was assigned menial tasks, marginalized from military planning, and forced to endure the condescension of Vietnamese commanders who viewed the Cambodians as ideologically backward. This profound humiliation forged a virulent, unyielding strain of ethno-nationalism within him. He concluded that true Cambodian independence could never be achieved as long as the revolutionary movement relied upon the Vietnamese. The seeds of extreme paranoia and a deeply ingrained, almost pathological hatred of Vietnam were planted in the humid jungles of the Eastern Zone, fundamentally shaping the xenophobic ideology of the movement he would eventually lead. Following the 1954 Geneva Accords, which formally ended the First Indochina War and secured full independence for Cambodia under the total political domination of King Sihanouk, the communist resistance was forced to disband or go deeply underground. Saloth Sar returned to Phnom Penh and assumed a masterful double life. To the public, he was an affable, soft-spoken professor of history, geography, and French literature at the Khmer Rouge, a private college in the capital. His students adored his gentle demeanor, his engaging teaching style, and his apparent dedication to their education. None suspected that this mild-mannered teacher was simultaneously operating as the chief recruiter and organizational mastermind for a clandestine communist network. By night, operating under various aliases, Sar systematically built a highly compartmentalized underground apparatus. He specifically targeted young, idealistic students and disillusioned urban intellectuals, manipulating their frustrations with Sihanouk's increasingly corrupt and autocratic regime. He patiently constructed a loyal cadre of followers who were totally devoted to him personally, insulating his network from the pervasive surveillance of Sihanouk's secret police. This period of covert organizing demonstrated his exceptional talent for manipulation, secrecy, and the slow, methodical accumulation of power from within the shadows. The culmination of this covert organizing occurred in September 1960 in a highly secretive meeting held within the empty cars of the Phnom Penh railway station. Here, the Workers' Party of Kampuchea was officially formed, establishing a formal, independent structure for the Cambodian communist movement. Tuol Sleng, a veteran revolutionary with close ties to the Vietnamese, was elected General Secretary, while Saloth Sar, rewarding his years of meticulous underground work, was elevated to the number 3 position in the Central Committee. The political landscape shifted violently 2 years later in July 1962 when Tuol Sleng mysteriously disappeared, presumed murdered by Sihanouk's security forces, though historical suspicions have long lingered that Sar himself orchestrated the assassination to clear his path to power. With Tuol Sleng eliminated, Saloth Sar swiftly outmaneuvered his rivals. At a hastily convened party congress in 1963, he was elected the General Secretary of the party. He immediately began purging the leadership of individuals loyal to Vietnam, replacing them with his trusted Parisian compatriots and loyalists from his underground student networks. The mild-mannered schoolteacher had successfully seized absolute control of the communist apparatus, transforming it into a personal instrument of revolutionary will. His ascension to leadership directly coincided with a brutal crackdown on leftist dissidents by Prince Sihanouk's increasingly paranoid security apparatus. Realizing that his cover was blown and his arrest was imminent, Saloth Sar and a small corps of his loyal lieutenants fled the capital in 1963, seeking refuge in the deep, untamed jungles of Ratanakiri province in the remote northeast. This desolate region, bordering Vietnam and Laos, became the birthplace of Base 100. Here, cut off from the modern world, Sar lived among the Khmer Rouge, the indigenous hill tribes who practiced slash-and-burn agriculture and animism. The profound isolation of the jungle had a radicalizing effect on his ideology. He became deeply romanticized by the lifestyle of the hill tribes, viewing their primitive, non-monetary communal existence as the purest manifestation of primitive communism. They possessed no currency, no formal markets, no education system, and no organized religion. In the eyes of Saloth Sar, these marginalized people were a blank slate, untainted by the corrupting influences of Buddhism, capitalism, and French colonialism. The harsh survivalism of the jungle and the perceived purity of the indigenous tribes provided the twisted foundational blueprint for the radical agrarian utopia he was determined to force upon the entire Cambodian nation. Determined to solidify his ideological framework and secure international backing, Saloth Sar embarked on a secretive, transformative journey to Hanoi and Beijing between 1965 and 1966. In Hanoi, his deep-seated suspicions were confirmed. The Vietnamese leadership treated him with condescension, urging the Cambodian communists to delay their armed struggle and support Vietnam's war against the Americans. Sar furiously rejected their directives. It was in Beijing, however, that he found his true ideological validation. He arrived precisely as Mao Zedong was launching the catastrophic Cultural Revolution. Sar was utterly captivated by the sheer scale of Mao's social engineering, the weaponization of the youth, the ruthless purging of the intellectual class, and the audacious concept of the Great Leap Forward. The Chinese endorsement of radical, immediate, and violent class struggle provided Sar with the ultimate justification for his own extremist vision. Upon returning to the Cambodian jungles, emboldened and radicalized beyond measure, he orchestrated the renaming of the party to the Communist Party of Kampuchea. This was a definitive, deeply symbolic break from Vietnamese influence, signaling to his followers that the Cambodian Revolution would be uniquely Khmer, utterly self-reliant, and infinitely more radical than anything the world had ever witnessed. The spark that ignited the Cambodian countryside occurred in 1968 with the localized peasant uprising in Sum Laut, which the Communist Party, now increasingly known by Sihanouk's derogatory moniker, the Khmer Rouge, eagerly co-opted to officially launch their armed struggle against the government. However, the true turning point in the trajectory of the movement came from an entirely unexpected geopolitical earthquake. In March 1970, Prince Sihanouk, the God King of Cambodia, was deposed in a right-wing military coup orchestrated by his own Prime Minister, General Lon Nol, with tacit American backing. Furious and seeking vengeance from his exile in Beijing, Sihanouk made a fateful radio broadcast urging the Cambodian peasantry to join his former enemies, the Khmer Rouge, in a unified resistance front against the Lon Nol regime. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of fiercely loyal peasants who would never have supported a Marxist insurgency flooded into the jungles in the name of restoring their revered king. Saloth Sar ruthlessly exploited this massive influx of manpower. He utilized the king's image to recruit an enormous army of illiterate, disenfranchised rural youth, brainwashing them into hardened, fanatical cadres who fought not for a monarch, but for the secretive, omnipotent entity known only as the Angkar.
As the Civil War raged with unprecedented brutality between 1970 and 1974, the strategic calculus of the Cold War exacted a horrific toll on the Cambodian countryside. In a desperate attempt to sever North Vietnamese supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the United States launched Operation Menu and Freedom Deal, a relentless, devastating carpet-bombing campaign that dropped hundreds of thousands of tons of explosives across eastern Cambodia. The destruction of villages, the massive displacement of populations, and the staggering civilian death toll created an atmosphere of absolute terror and apocalyptic despair. Saloth Sar and the Khmer Rouge leadership weaponized this immense human trauma. They utilized the craters and the corpses as the ultimate propaganda tools, channeling the profound grief and rage of the surviving peasantry into a virulent, fanatical hatred of the Lone Nol government, city dwellers, and all foreign influences. The American bombs essentially did the recruiting for the Angkar. The Khmer Rouge army, once a small band of jungle insurgents, swelled into a massive, terrifyingly disciplined military machine, characterized by absolute obedience, extreme youth, and a complete disregard for human life, ready to unleash vengeance upon the capital. The inevitable climax of the Civil War arrived on the morning of April 17, 1975. The heavily armed, battle-hardened, and ominously silent teenage soldiers of the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh, marking the definitive collapse of the U.S.-backed Lon Nol regime. The exhausted, starving residents of the capital initially flooded the streets, cheering the arrival of peace after 5 years of devastating conflict. But the illusion of liberation was shattered within mere hours. Acting on orders meticulously planned by Saloth Sar months in advance, the cadres unleashed a torrent of violence, ordering the total and immediate evacuation of the city's 2 million residents. At gunpoint, under the fabricated pretext of an imminent American bombing raid, hospital patients were tipped from their beds, the elderly were forced to march, and families were driven out onto the choked highways leading into the countryside. There were no exceptions, no delays, and no mercy. The forced exodus of Phnom Penh was not merely a military tactic, it was the psychological annihilation of urban society, the deliberate destruction of the educated class, and the brutal initiation rite of a new, horrifying era. It was the absolute, unyielding commencement of Year Zero. With the cities emptied and the population scattered across the rural landscape, the state was officially reconstituted as Democratic Kampuchea, and the phantom leader of the Angkar finally stepped from the shadows, adopting the nom de guerre Pol Pot, becoming Brother Number One. The radical agrarian utopia he had envisioned in the jungles was immediately, violently implemented on a national scale. The restructuring of society was absolute and terrifyingly comprehensive. Money was abolished and the central bank was blown up. Free markets, private property, and all forms of organized religion were eradicated. Schools and universities were shuttered, books were burned, and the traditional family unit was systematically dismantled to ensure total psychological loyalty to the Angkar. The entire country was transformed into a vast, inescapable agricultural gulag. Millions of former urbanites, dehumanized as new people, were subjected to relentless forced labor in the rice fields, working grueling, endless shifts under the scorching sun with meager, starvation-level rations of watery rice gruel. Pol Pot's delusional demand to triple national rice production to fund an industrialized communist state completely ignored basic agronomy and human endurance, guaranteeing mass starvation on a scale previously unimaginable in Southeast Asia. As the agrarian economy collapsed and starvation ravaged the populace,
Pol Pot's deep-seated paranoia metastasized, leading him to believe that the failures of the revolution were not due to his flawed ideology, but the result of vast networks of hidden traitors and foreign saboteurs. To cleanse the party of these imagined enemies, the Angkar established a horrifying security apparatus, the crown jewel of which was Security Prison 21, known as Tuol Sleng, housed in a former high school in Phnom Penh. Commanded by the meticulously cruel former mathematics teacher, Comrade Douche, S-21 became an industrialized slaughterhouse designed for the interrogation, torture, and execution of perceived internal threats. High-ranking party officials, loyal military commanders, intellectuals, and completely innocent civilians were dragged into its blood-stained cells. Through unspeakable medieval forms of physical and psychological torture, the victims were forced to write absurd, elaborate confessions admitting to working for the CIA, the KGB, or Vietnamese intelligence. Once a confession was signed and the victim had implicated dozens of others, thereby feeding the endless cycle of paranoia, their execution was guaranteed. The machinery of the Khmer Rouge was actively, relentlessly self-cannibalizing, directed by the absolute terror emanating from Brother Number One.
The horrors of S-21, however, represented merely the bureaucratic apex of a nationwide campaign of extermination that would become infamously known as the killing fields. Across the scarred countryside of Democratic Kampuchea, execution centers like Chewing Ek operated with chilling mechanical efficiency. Survival became an entirely arbitrary lottery. People were bludgeoned to death with hose and iron bars to save the cost of bullets for the slightest perceived infractions. Foraging for wild fruit, crying over a deceased child, wearing eyeglasses, speaking a foreign language, or possessing soft hands indicative of an intellectual past. The regime systematically targeted ethnic minorities, attempting to completely eradicate the Muslim Cham, the ethnic Vietnamese, and the Chinese communities through targeted massacres and forced assimilation. The sheer scale of the slaughter is almost beyond human comprehension. In a mere 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days, an estimated 1.5 to 2 million Cambodians, roughly a quarter of the entire population, perished. They were victims of deliberate execution, systemic starvation, untreated disease, and being worked to death in a catastrophic, nationwide social engineering experiment birthed from the deeply paranoid, radicalized mind of Pol Pot. The ultimate downfall of Democratic Kampuchea was not brought about by an internal uprising of the starved and traumatized population, but by Pol Pot's own fatal miscalculation, driven by his virulent ethno-nationalism and historical grievances. Obsessed with the ancient glory of the Angkor Empire and consumed by a pathological hatred of Vietnam, he ordered preemptive, brutal cross-border military incursions into Vietnamese territory throughout 1977 and 1978. Khmer Rouge soldiers crossed the border, systematically massacring thousands of Vietnamese civilians in border villages, burning homes, and committing unspeakable atrocities. Pol Pot, blinded by his delusion of Khmer racial superiority, fundamentally underestimated the military capability of his neighbors. He truly believed that a single Cambodian soldier was worth 30 Vietnamese. The government in Hanoi, having recently unified their own country after defeating the United States, possessed one of the largest and most battle-hardened armies in the world. Tolerating the erratic and bloody provocations no longer, the Vietnamese military resolved to permanently eliminate the threat on their western border. On December 25, 1978, Vietnam launched a massive, full-scale invasion of Democratic Kampuchea, bringing the full weight of their mechanized infantry and air superiority against the radicalized
but technologically inferior forces of the Khmer Rouge. The military collapse of Democratic Kampuchea was shockingly swift. By January 7, 1979, Vietnamese armored columns rolled into the deserted ghost city of Phnom Penh, forcing Pol Pot and the surviving senior leadership of the Khmer Rouge to flee in absolute disarray. Retreating westward, they sought sanctuary in the dense, malaria-infested jungles along the border with Thailand, dragging tens of thousands of captive civilians with them. In a perverse twist of Cold War geopolitics, the perpetrators of one of the worst genocides in human history found themselves protected and sustained by international powers. Because the Vietnamese invasion was backed by the Soviet Union, the United States, China, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, chose to recognize the exiled Khmer Rouge as the legitimate government of Cambodia. For the next decade, Pol Pot directed a protracted, agonizing guerrilla war from his jungle enclaves, rearming his forces with international aid funneled through Thailand. The architect of the killing fields was insulated from justice by the machinations of global diplomacy, allowing his radical movement to endure, plant millions of landmines across the country, and continue inflicting suffering upon the Cambodian people long after his regime had fallen.
The final act of Pol Pot's life was characterized by a slow, agonizing decay of his power and movement throughout the 1990s. As the Cold War ended and international support evaporated, the Khmer Rouge fractured under the weight of internal paranoia, mass defections to the new Cambodian government, and bitter mutinies. In a desperate attempt to retain control in 1997, Pol Pot ordered the execution of his lifelong comrade Son Sen and his entire family, triggering a final, fatal backlash. He was overthrown and placed under house arrest by his own ruthless military commander, Ta Mok. Condemned in a bizarre jungle show trial by the very movement he created, the former dictator was reduced to a frail, unrepentant old man confined to a wooden hut. On April 15, 1998, just as rumors swirled that he was to be handed over to an international tribunal, Pol Pot died, officially, of heart failure. His body was unceremoniously burned on a pyre of old tires and rubbish in the jungle, denying the world the justice of a trial. He departed a nation physically shattered and psychologically scarred for generations, leaving behind a legacy of absolute tyranny, the chilling evidence of the mass graves, and the enduring, haunting memory of the killing fields.